In Palestine, every year between 500 and 700 children in the dead of the night get taken from their homes. They go to military courts. This is the other system. There are two systems. That's why we also call it apartheid. Israeli settlers are not taken to military courts, but in the West Bank, etc., it's just Palestinians. And there is a 90% conviction rate. It's absolute discrimination. You have to be blind not to see this happening. This is, I mean, there's nothing to say about blind people. There are many comrades who are not sighted who understand this. These young people in Palestine suffer greatly. At the moment, because of the bombardments, the assaults, particularly on Gaza, it is estimated by psychologists globally that 195,000 children need urgent assistance because of the trauma. Since 2005, over 1,000 children have been killed because of these attacks on Gaza. And Gaza is not even an open-air prison any longer. You know, the medieval siege over 10 years now. It's vicious and it's cruel. And the point, as Jeff Halper, some of you heard him speak, and if you can get a chance, please try and get hold of his book, War Against the People. He talks about how the occupation, Israel actually profits from it. How the occupation has allowed it to build this industrial military complex. Because of the occupation, these horrible weapons, the dime bomb, all these cruel weaponry are field tested on the bodies of Palestinian men, women, and children. And the West encourages Israel to do this because they trade with Israel around the high security technology. They benefit from the methods of controlling the Palestinian people. They benefit from this trade in weaponry, the drone system, and all of that. Now, the other reason why, besides understanding the discrimination Palestinians face, the other reason why South Africans identify with the struggle of Palestinians is that we recognize that Israel played a role in our own oppression. For instance, Israel was an important arms supplier to South Africa. Despite the international arms embargo, and as late as 1980, 35% of Israel's arms exports were destined for South Africa. And Israel was loyal to the racist apartheid state in South Africa and clung onto its friendship with South Africa when almost all other relationships dissolved, even countries in the West. And during the 1970s, this affiliation extended into the field of nuclear weaponry, because with Israel's support, South Africa developed 6 nuclear bombs. And a lot has been written about this. There's a book by Surensky the title of which is An Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa. There are on many other levels that Israel cooperated. They trained the security police. They supported the Bantustans in South Africa, these cruel places which were dumping grounds for surplus labor by the apartheid regime. Older people and others who were not required to work in the mines and the farms were dumped in the Bantustans, and Israel had companies in the Bantustans subsidized by the apartheid regime. Israel imported South African goods and re-exported them to the world as a form of inter-racist solidarity. And there are many other reasons why we in South Africa feel so strongly about the apartheid system in Israel. I also want to say that last year, I think it was the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And you have to understand that both countries, South Africa and Israel, were settler colonial entities. That what we have in Israel is a situation which relied on white supremacy, the role the British imperialism played. It's an accident of history that both societies was formed in 1948. Apartheid South Africa, of course, apartheid-like laws existed before 1948. The pass laws were not called the pass laws, but the migrant labor system was based on the pass laws. But both systems were developed into particular racist states. They also had this messianic vision of themselves as God's chosen people. Many Israelis talked about this is a land for a people without a land. You know, they had this view that it is a promised land, and they used the Old Testament as somehow a title deed. This is, and the good Lord is the landlord who dispenses this title deed. And this goes completely against history. It's a myth. It's propaganda. What we have is a classic case of settler colonialism, and it's a colonial situation. I want to come to issues of the academy, and I need to say that the university in South Africa played a critical role in bolstering the apartheid system, in reproducing structural inequalities and injustices. And it's no different. It's no different in Israel. The university is not different from what the university was in South Africa. Israeli universities and a number of individual Israeli academics play key roles in providing the intellectual support for the Israeli state and its endeavors. Many of the Israeli universities have very strong links to the military establishment. Including various forms of support to those who serve in the military. A number of Israeli academics provide the practical and ideological support necessary for the maintenance of the occupation and even for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Extrajudicial killings, racial segregation, and land expropriation. Palestinian colleagues, through the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, have compellingly shown how Israeli academics collude with the occupation. Ethnic cleansing and racism in practical terms whether it's through engineering, through geography, demography, hydrology, psychology, amongst many other disciplines. There is a connection to maintain the system of apartheid. And it was Uri Keller, an Israeli, who wrote a wonderful booklet, concretely, scientifically, showing how Israeli academics bolster the apartheid system. You can Google, you can get the material. Significant percentage of Israeli exports are comprised of high-tech goods. And these goods are the product of an industry highly dependent on academic training and connections. Technion, which you are very familiar with, its close collaboration with Albert Systems, the military in Israel, enough has been written about that. There's enough information about it. Now, I want to move towards the end by talking about this issue that a number of people talk about in criticizing the academic boycott, and they talk about academic freedom. It's an issue that was raised when we started agitating for the boycott of Ben Gurion University in South Africa as well. Now, the first point we made is that academic freedom in the case of violent occupation, academic freedom in the case of apartheid, of genocide, of gross human rights abuse, must really surely bear some reference to those very conditions for the criteria of its determination. In other words, what I'm saying, you can't separate the socio-economic political context from the academy. I've tried to show how it is complicit. You can't separate it. And the failure to recognize this will mean that the very concept of freedom more generally, and academic freedom in particular, becomes both meaningless and bereft of any practical possibilities. Now, the basic rights of academics, as explained not by me or some Palestinians, but by UNESCO. They have documented how Palestinian academics and Palestinian students do not have academic freedom. Israeli academics have freedom. They can travel to conferences around the world. They can deliver scientific papers. Palestinian academics find it extremely difficult, particularly those who take a stand against the injustice and the discrimination of their own people. We know this as a fact. But when people throw this phrase, academic freedom, they don't raise that issue at all. They don't raise the fact that hundreds of Palestinian schools were bombed. And some of them UN schools, by the way. There are hundreds of Palestinian academics, lecturers, and students detained as a regular event in Palestine. And these things affect academic freedom. The freedom to go to universities and not be blocked off by checkpoints, or the apartheid war, which the International Court of Justice has condemned as illegal, by the way. So, the point is that academic freedom does not exist for Palestinian academics, but also that unlike other countries where human rights abuses exist, Israel, in fact, is not sanctioned by governments, but it is pampered and privileged by the West instead of being sanctioned like many countries, and despite Israel's violation of international law and conventions. Now, a number of Palestinian and Israeli and South African academics have all said, and I'm quoting one Israeli academic, Oren Ben-Dor, who argued that a boycott to foster real academic freedom in Israel should unite academics all over the world. The boycott I wish to see is a boycott intended to produce academic freedom. And that is the critical thing in South Africa as well. My white colleagues at the academy today come to me and say, Elena, that if it wasn't for the boycott campaign against apartheid South Africa, we would be happy. We would be blind. We wouldn't see what is happening, because apartheid South Africa, like apartheid Israel, has this ability to make people forget about the people just down the road who you can't access because of checkpoints, because of walls, and because of laws. So it's convenient. Your comfort is not, you don't feel uncomfortable because you are not confronted with it. It is only your privilege. It's only when your privilege is at stake then your eyes open. And like in South Africa, many white colleagues says that this is a boycott in order to produce academic freedom, because there was no academic freedom in South Africa, as there is no academic freedom for Palestinians. So by being against that tool, which is a tactic, you are sanctioning the discrimination of Palestinian academics because you're treating them differently. There is not an equivalence in your feelings of compassion for the people who live in that part of the world. There is another issue to show that academic freedom is not an idle abstraction. Professor Hilary Rose, a sociologist of science, reminds us of academics, and I have to say something about Professor Hilary Rose and her husband Stephen Rose. They are both involved in bioscience, in the sociology of science, and both of them have suffered, their families suffered greatly because of the Holocaust. And they are leading members of BRICUP, the British Academic Association that supports the BDS campaign. And this is what Hilary said. She says, she reminds us of academics, including, by the way, liberal and left geneticists who actively collaborated with their German counterparts, who provided the scientific basis for this really truly ugly concept of lives not living, or Rassenhygiene. It's related to eugenics. Some people are superior and others are inferior. Some people must be gotten rid of, because that is what Nazism did to those people who were disabled, to those people who were Jewish, who were Roma, etc., who were not clean. It's an ugly concept. But what happened is, Hilary says there was collaborations with those who ended up experimenting on people's bodies to prove this horrible myth, to attempt to prove it. She says here, an absolutist principle of academic freedom facilitated, encouraged the eugenic project of the final solution. It is instructive, as I told you, that both Hilary and Stephen Rose continue campaigning and supporting PAPBI, the Palestinian academics, majority of whom are Palestinian academics support PAPBI, who speak to the way discrimination and apartheid happens and how it is supported by apartheid, how the academy supports apartheid. The chair is not telling me to round up. I think people in Italy are very generous with time, but I don't want to detain you for too long. You've been very patient with me. But I want to perhaps end now because I would prefer, I can go on and on, but I would prefer you to ask me questions. There are many aspects of the academic boycott, of apartheid I've left out because I'm conscious of the time. But I just want to end with what a colleague, Professor Virginia Tilley, had to say. She said, and she wrote this a number of years ago. It's even more pertinent today. She says, it is finally time, after years of internal arguments, confusion, and dithering, the time has come for a fully fledged international boycott of Israel. Good cause for the boycott has, of course, been in place for decades, as a raft of initiatives already attest. But Israel's war crimes are now so shocking, its extremism so clear, the suffering so great, the UN so helpless, and the international community's need to contain Israel's behavior so urgent and compelling that the time for global action on the scale that we saw against apartheid South Africa has matured. A coordinated movement of divestment, sanctions, and boycotts against Israel must convene to contain not only Israel's aggressive acts and crimes against humanitarian law, and it's the country that has violated the most humanitarian laws that exist, and treaties and conventions, but also, as in South Africa, its founding racist logics, as I've shown, that inspired and still drive the entire issue of Palestine. Thank you very much.